The sky did not turn red by accident. It happened slowly at first, just a strange tint along the horizon, like a warning no one quite understood. Fishermen off the coast of northern Australia reported it first. Then came the silence. Radios crackled. Satellites blinked. And somewhere deep over the ocean, something massive had already decided its path. They would later call it Cyclone Narelle. But in those first moments, no one knew just how far it would go or how many times it would come back. The storm began like many others, an unassuming swirl of pressure over warm tropical waters. But conditions were different this time. The ocean was hotter, the air was heavier, and the atmosphere unstable. Within hours, what started as a disturbance intensified into a force that meteorologists struggled to keep up with. Wind speeds climbed, pressure dropped, and then came the moment that changed everything, the upgrade, Category 5. Two words that carry weight but rarely deliver this kind of consequence. At its peak, the cyclone reached winds of 275 kilometers per hour. That number alone doesn't tell the full story. These weren't just winds, they were walls of moving air, powerful enough to peel structures apart, to lift debris like feathers, to erase entire stretches of coastline in minutes. And still, it was only beginning. The first landfall came quietly, almost deceptively. Communities in northern Queensland had prepared, as they always do. Windows boarded, supplies stocked, evacuation centers opened, but no preparation accounts for the unknown. When the eye crossed the coast, everything changed. The wind did not howl, it roared. Buildings groaned under pressure. Trees bent until they snapped. And then, in one terrifying moment, the roof of an evacuation center was torn clean away. 40 people were inside. What happened next remains difficult to piece together. Survivors describe a deafening blast, followed by chaos, rain and debris pouring into what was supposed to be the safest place available. In the darkness, voices shouted, hands reached, and somehow most made it through. But the storm did not stay. It moved inland, weakened slightly, and then did something no one expected. It turned. Back over open water, Cyclone Narelle began to re-strengthen. Meteorologists watched in disbelief as the system reorganized itself, feeding once again on the heat below. Forecast models struggled, predictions shifted by the hour, and then it made landfall again, this time in the Northern Territory. Communities, already on edge, now faced a second assault. Infrastructure weakened from the first impact could not hold. Roads vanished beneath floodwaters. Communication lines failed. Emergency services were stretched thin, chasing a storm that refused to follow the rules. By the third landfall, something else happened, something stranger. Far to the west, over Shark Bay, the sky turned red. Not orange, not pink, red. Satellite images later showed massive dust plumes being pulled into the storm system, mixing with moisture and light in a way that transformed the atmosphere into something almost otherworldly. Day turned into a dim, crimson haze. People described it as apocalyptic, like standing inside a warning no one could ignore. And still the cyclone moved forward. Western Australia braced for impact, but few expected the scale. Offshore, some of the world's largest liquefied natural gas operations stood directly in its path. These were not small installations. They were critical nodes in a global energy network facilities designed to withstand extreme conditions. But even they have limits. As the storm intensified offshore, operators made a decision that would ripple far beyond Australia's coastline. Platforms shut down, production halted, safety protocols activated. Within hours, a significant portion of global LNG supply, nearly 8%, was offline. Markets reacted instantly. Prices surged. Governments monitored the situation closely. Because this was no longer just a natural disaster. It was an economic shock. Back on land, the fourth landfall came with less warning than the others. Exhaustion had set in, not just in the infrastructure, but in the people. Emergency crews had been working non-stop. Evacuations had already displaced thousands. And yet, the storm returned one last time. By now, the landscape itself had changed. Flooded regions became inland seas. Roads were unrecognizable. Entire communities were cut off, reachable only by air. Helicopters moved constantly, rescuing, delivering, searching. And through it all, the wind never seemed to fully stop. In the aftermath, the numbers began to emerge. Damages spread across 3 states. Critical infrastructure compromised. Energy supply disrupted on a global scale. But numbers don't capture the experience. They don't describe the moment when the sky changed color. They don't explain what it feels like to hear a building begin to fail. They don't measure the uncertainty of watching a storm leave, only to return stronger. Cyclone Narelle did something rare. It didn't just strike once, it rewrote expectations. Meteorologists would later analyze its path, its behavior, its intensity. They would study the ocean temperatures, the atmospheric conditions, the anomalies that allowed it to sustain such power across multiple landfalls. But even with all the data, one question lingered. What if this is not an exception? What if this is a preview? Because storms are changing. Patterns are shifting. And the systems that once defined limits are being tested in ways that were once considered unlikely. Communities rebuild, they always do. Structures are reinforced. Plans are updated. Lessons are learned. But there is something about a storm that refuses to follow the script that leaves a lasting mark. Something about a sky turning red in the middle of the day. Something about a force that returns again and again and again. And somewhere, far out over the water, where the next system is already forming, the conditions are waiting, the heat is still there, the pressure is still shifting. And the question is no longer if another storm will come. It's when. Because Cyclone Narelle did not just pass through Australia, it left behind a message, one written in wind, water, and a sky that turned the color of warning. And the most unsettling part, that message may only be the beginning. The first warning came quietly. Meteorologists noticed an unusual swirl over the coral sea, a small disturbance that most would have ignored. But the waters were hotter than usual, the air unusual tense. Something was stirring, and it was not going to be ordinary. They named it Cyclone Narelle. At first, it seemed like any other tropical storm. Winds whispered over the water, waves lapped against empty beaches. But then, overnight, the system intensified. The satellite images revealed a terrifying symmetry, a perfect eye forming in the heart of the storm, a cyclone that refused to behave like the others. Within 24 hours, it escalated to Category 5. People in Queensland were alerted, communities prepared for the worst, yet no preparation could truly match the scale of what was coming. Winds reached 275 kilometers per hour, walls of air that could rip apart the strongest structures. The first landfall hit the Cape York Peninsula. The storm moved like a predator, methodic, relentless. Trees snapped like twigs. Power lines tumbled into the streets. Roofs lifted, sometimes carrying people with them. One evacuation center, designed to withstand severe weather, was ripped apart. 40 souls inside survived, but only barely, clinging to what remained as rain and debris flooded the room. Narelle did not pause. After crossing the peninsula, it moved back to sea, gaining strength from the heat of the ocean. The Northern Territory braced for a second strike. Residents who had survived the first landfall watched the sky with dread. Rain came first, then wind, then the full fury of the storm itself. The riverbeds swelled, roads vanished, communications collapsed. Helicopters struggled to navigate the storm, searching for stranded communities. And as it approached Western Australia, an otherworldly scene unfolded. Shark Bay, a place usually serene, turned crimson. Dust and sand from inland deserts rose into the storm, blending with moisture in the air, creating a blood-red haze. People described it as apocalyptic, surreal, like standing inside a painting of disaster. The sun itself seemed to have vanished behind the storm. Offshore, the storm struck industrial targets with unprecedented force. Chevron's Gorgon and Wheatstone platforms, along with Woodside's Northwest Shelf, were forced to shut down. Nearly 8% of the world's liquefied natural gas supply vanished within hours. Markets trembled, governments reacted, energy grids worldwide strained under the sudden disruption. Back on land, the storm's fourth landfall struck without warning. Western Australia's coastline bore the brunt. Entire towns were flooded. Roads became rivers. Rescue teams worked around the clock, often unable to reach communities cut off by water. Helicopters swooped over submerged buildings, pulling out the stranded. People clung to hope amid the relentless roar of wind and rain. By the time Narelle finally moved away from land, the landscape was unrecognizable. Towns were flattened, forests stripped bare, rivers overflowing. Yet, for all the destruction, the storm left a message. A warning that nature had grown unpredictable, violent, and unstoppable in ways humanity was only beginning to understand. Meteorologists analyzed the storm for weeks. How could one cyclone hit 4 times? How could it sustain Category 5 strength over such distances? Satellite imagery revealed unusual thermal patterns, winds that fed into themselves, and atmospheric anomalies that defied expectations. The aftermath was sobering. Energy markets scrambled. Governments activated emergency funds. Rebuilding began. But in every community from Queensland to Western Australia, people remembered the sky that had turned red, the winds that would not relent, and the feeling of helplessness in the face of pure, unbridled power. And yet, as the news crews packed their cameras and the floodwaters began to recede, one fact remained. The ocean was still warm. Storms like Narelle were not anomalies. They were signs of what was to come. Somewhere out there, the next system was forming, and when it emerged, it would carry